Dan Bongino leaned toward his mic today, stating he would demonstrate she was the greatest charlatan in legislative history. And he spoke so tranquilly, it sounded like a meteorological update, or a plain truth everyone present would soon acknowledge. The hearing chamber of the House Oversight Committee fell utterly quiet, as every lens and every journalist and every aide stood motionless. Then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez chuckled not with nerves, but with a rehearsed sound she had perfected before mirrors, to signal this man was beneath her, and to look flawless on social media feeds. This ought to be entertaining, she thought, leaning into her microphone while her $3,000 jacket caught the studio lights perfectly because her staff selected that specific garment for the broadcast. They had devoted 45 minutes to her appearance that morning, since this was intended to be her highlight reel where she dismantled a Republican witness for another viral video. A failed police officer turned podcaster intends to lecture me regarding fraud. She paused for impact, scanning the room with staged incredulity. What comes next? Are you attempting to vend gold bullion? Or perhaps emergency rations for the end of times? She asked, drawing scattered giggles from the Democratic side of the aisle. Several aides retrieved their devices to record what they presumed would be another Ocasio-Cortez victory, because she was in her element, now doing what she did best. She was the queen of retorts, the warrior of social platforms, the voice of a generation, and she suggested he stick to shouting into a mic for enraged baby boomers. Leave the actual governance to individuals who genuinely comprehend policy, she added, causing more laughter, while an aide gestured approval with a thumbs up. Bongino remained motionless, sitting absolutely still, with hands clasped on the desk, observing her display with the tolerance of a man who served 12 years in the Secret Service. He had guarded commanders-in-chief and confronted authentic perils, so he had mastered the art of waiting until the giggling ceased and the silence lengthened. Ocasio-Cortez's grin wavered for a split second, because she was unaccustomed to adversaries who refused to react, since she thrived on responses and required them. "Are you finished?" Bongino inquired with a voice that was level and unimpressed, to which she replied, "I am merely beginning tough guy, since you represent everything wrong with government." Bongino reached down, opening his briefcase, which was scuffed leather and practical rather than elegant, and said to him, He withdrew a solitary file that was neither thick nor theatrical, but simply a standard manila folder bearing a typed label on the cover. He placed it on the surface, angling it so every camera in the chamber could capture the text, which read, "Ocasio-Cortez the fraud." The room rustled as murmurs spread through the audience when Bongino allowed the words $47 million to hang in the atmosphere without rushing them. He gave the figure room to resonate, stating, "That is the sum that passed through your web of PACs and shell entities over 4 years. 47 million obtained from individuals who placed their faith in you," he said, opening the file to reveal he knew where every solitary cent traveled. "I have tracked every transfer and every expenditure and every falsehood," he stated, gazing squarely at her with eyes that were unshakable and sure. "By the time I conclude matters here today, everyone watching will know as well," he said, withdrawing the initial document, adding, "You should have remained a bartender, Congresswoman." At least that was a respectable profession, he noted, while Ocasio-Cortez parted her lips to answer or to retort, as she usually did, but no sound emerged. For the initial time in her political trajectory, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez possessed nothing to say, while Dan Bongino was merely commencing his presentation. Bongino turned to the first segment of the binder, moving with the systematic calm of a man who had constructed cases against narcotic syndicates and shielded leaders from killers. Each motion was intentional, and every silence was measured, as he suggested, starting with something basic, like discussing how she resided. Ocasio-Cortez rolled her eyes with rehearsed indifference, saying, "Here we go again with the right-wing fixation on my wardrobe, which is very original and creative. It is not your attire, Congresswoman, but your decisions, and the chasm between what you advocate and how you authentically conduct your existence," he replied, extracting a lease. "You speak frequently regarding accessible housing, calling it a fundamental right, and claiming working households are being decimated by rent and expelled from their communities. You say they are forced to select between sustenance and shelter. Yet he placed the lease on the table showing your flat in Navy Yard costs $3,500 monthly. It is a luxury complex featuring a rooftop swimming pool and a modern gym and a 24-hour concierge service," he noted, looking up at her. "That rental payment exceeds what most households in your district generate in a full month, not just for rent, but their entire earnings. Everything they accumulate from working 2 or 3 jobs is less than your rent," while Ocasio-Cortez adjusted in her chair, shifting her posture slightly. The cameras recorded the movement as she argued that is standard for D.C. housing costs because members of Congress require 2 residences. "Do they?" Bongino asked, withdrawing another paper, which was a spreadsheet containing highlighted rows showing available units within 2 miles of the Capitol. "Here is a roster of apartments under $2,000 and some under $1,500, which are modest spaces where working individuals actually reside." He placed the list down, noting you did not desire those because you wanted the premium building with amenities most of your voters will never encounter. "You chose the one costing more per month than some of them earn in 6 weeks of full-time labor," he said, pausing for effect. "There is nothing wrong with desiring quality items, Congresswoman, and nothing wrong with enjoying prosperity. But there is an issue building a brand on telling others they cannot have luxuries. You live in opulence while telling them to abstain," he said. As her lawyer leaned close to whisper something, she waved away with an annoyed motion. Bongino proceeded to the subsequent exhibit, proposing they discuss the Green New Deal, which was her signature legislation that made her a national celebrity. He withdrew a dense document, reminding her she stood on the House floor, claiming climate change is an existential menace, giving us 12 years to act. "You stated the world as we know it will cease, and every American must drastically alter how they live and travel and consume." He produced a spreadsheet revealing 66 flights in 12 months exposed in FAA logs where every single trip was first class or business class. The room buzzed as he noted, "Your personal carbon emission from air travel alone is greater than 20 average American families combined." 20 households in a single year. He emphasized setting the spreadsheet down, adding, "You want workers to surrender their vehicles and stop eating meat. You want them to fundamentally reshape their existence to rescue the globe," he said, looking at her. "But first class is more pleasant, isn't it?" Ocasio-Cortez grasped her microphone with her voice pitched higher, claiming those were professional flights for official congressional duties. Were they? Bongino produced a photograph holding it up so every lens could view it clearly, showing Miami Beach in February of 21, while Texas froze. While people were literally perishing without electricity or warmth, the picture displayed Ocasio-Cortez in swimwear with a glass of champagne laughing at a beach cabana. You flew to Florida for a donor event at a waterfront estate, while your peers organized relief and your New York constituents faced winter emergencies. He placed the photo down, noting this image was shared by an acquaintance of yours on Instagram who deleted it within an hour when critics noted the optics. "But nothing truly vanishes from the web," he said, extracting another image showing her back in New York, 2 days later, tweeting about climate justice. You spoke of the urgent necessity for the Green New Deal, he said, regarding her with something nearing pity. Adding the champagne on the beach was lovely, though. Ocasio-Cortez's face turned crimson, and her hands clutched the table edge as she stammered, "That was a previously planned event." But Bongino interrupted, saying, "Let's move on." He was uninterested in her justifications because he was constructing a case, noting she championed defunding the police, saying communities do not require armed officers. You claim money should go to social services and mental health staff and community initiatives, anything except police, he said, spreading out a fresh set of papers. Your personal security costs for the past 2 years were exposed through financial disclosures your office attempted diligently to conceal in paperwork, he said, pointing to figures. Over $70,000 exposed right here in black and white. He said, looking at her, noting, armed private guards are trained professionals with weapons. You keep them to ensure your safety, while telling single mothers in the Bronx they do not require police protection, which is completely different, she argued. I receive credible death threats and my life has been in danger, she said. But Bongino's voice hardened as he replied, So do they, Congresswoman, the single mother laboring on the night shift at a market in your district, and the elderly man walking from church face threats daily. The children attempting to reach school through gang territory face real and constant danger. He paused, noting the difference is they cannot afford $70,000. You utilize private security yet want to remove the only protection they possess, he said as the room fell totally silent, and typing ceased. Bongino withdrew one more batch of papers from this section regarding her staff and the people who work for her daily. These are the young idealists who trusted your message and desired to join your movement, he said, reading from an official filing of anonymous complaints. Let me read you some excerpts, he said, adjusting his glasses, quoting, The Congresswoman demands total loyalty, but treats aides like personal servants. Unpaid overtime is mandatory, and any grievances are met with intimidation regarding career outcomes, he read, flipping to another page of the report. She preaches regarding worker rights on television, yet operates her own office like a sweatshop, where interns work full-time hours without pay. She delivers speeches about living wages while screaming at junior staff for retrieving the wrong coffee, he read, setting the documents down. The champion of the laboring class cannot even treat her own employees with fundamental human decency, he noted as Ocasio-Cortez's voice cracked, denying the claims. Those complaints were never verified and are anonymous accusations from disgruntled people, she argued. But he countered, they are sworn statements filed under penalty of perjury. They come from people who worked for you and believed in you and saw who you truly are when the cameras are not rolling. Bongino closed that portion of the binder, stating, living as a hypocrite is not actually a felony, but it is merely sad and pathetic. It is simply evidence that you do not believe a single word of what you preach, he said, opening the next section where pages were denser. This is where we arrive at the actual felonies, Bongino said, taking a slow breath because he understood pacing and how to construct tension. This was the segment that would terminate careers, so he said, let's discuss money, specifically the $47 million that moved through your network. He produced a complicated chart with lines linking boxes and arrows indicating currency flows with names and groups tangled like a net. Brand New Congress, PAC, and Justice Democrats, and Courage to Change PAC are 3 organizations connected to you moving cash in patterns resembling laundering. Ocasio-Cortez forced a dismissive chuckle, claiming those are legitimate political groups supporting progressive candidates across the nation. But he interrupted her explanation. They were used to cycle money until no one could track where it actually went, Bongino said, holding up the diagram to explain it. Let me guide you through it step by step, simply enough for everyone viewing at home to comprehend," he said, pointing to the initial box. Donations arrive at brand new Congress PAC from small donors and working people who believed your message about battling corruption and aiding the little guy. They contributed $20 or $50 or whatever they could spare, and some skipped meals to donate, he said, tracing a line on the graphic. That capital is then paid to Brand New Congress LLC, which is a private limited liability company for campaign services, which sounds legitimate. Another line showed Brand New Congress LLC, then pays a firm called Middle Seat Consulting for more services, and he asked if she could guess the owner. Silence followed as he named her former chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, the same man who founded Justice Democrats, and recruited her to run. The man who found you at a casting call for progressive candidates, yes, a casting call. Bongino emphasized setting the diagram down. The cash travels in a circle from PAC to LLC to consulting firm and back into the pockets of your inner circle. Along the route, millions of dollars simply vanish into vague classifications like operating costs and consulting fees, he said, extracting official filings. Federal Election Commission records indicate over $1 million in payments cannot be properly accounted for because documentation is absent and services are undefined. The money just disappeared, he said, spreading the papers out, noting the FEC has received multiple formal complaints regarding these arrangements. They have been investigating for years, but charges have not been filed because the commission is deadlocked along partisan lines, he noted, looking at her. But the FB does not possess that issue, and they have been examining this very closely, he added, as her attorney wrote furiously on a pad. Let us discuss something more specific. Bongino continued, proposing they talk about her boyfriend, which made the room go very still. Riley Roberts is your longtime partner, and by all accounts a nice enough individual, but not a political operative or campaign strategist. His background is in web development, Bongino said, setting down payment records showing her campaign and associated PACs paid him $6,000 monthly. Every month, for over a year, he received checks for marketing consulting. He said, doing the math aloud, to total $72,000. That is donor money for marketing consulting, he said, looking at Ocasio-Cortez, asking what he produced and what campaigns he created. What marketing strategies did he develop, and what deliverables exist with his name on them? He asked as the silence stretched in the room. I will answer for you, Congresswoman, nothing, because there is no portfolio and no documented work product and no evidence he did anything. There were just checks written to your boyfriend from funds donated by workers who thought they were supporting a political movement, he stated. Ocasio-Cortez's voice rose defensively, claiming Riley provided valuable digital strategy and ongoing consultation, but Bongino's voice cut through her explanation, demanding proof. Show this committee one single piece of work, he said, asking for one strategy document or one campaign creative or one email chain. She did not respond, so he said, I have reviewed every filing and his name appears only on payment records, never on work. He pulled out another paper saying, here is where it gets interesting. Let me tell you about Maria Gonzalez. And paused. Maria Gonzalez is a single mother of two living in the Bronx, in the district you claim to represent and fight for. He set down a printed statement noting Maria works 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night and working at a laundromat during the day. She makes about $14 an hour with no benefits and no sick days and no vacation, he said, looking at the document. In 2018, Maria donated $50 to your campaign, which represented a full day's wages for her, meaning she skipped buying groceries. She believed in you and watched your videos, seeing someone who looked like her and talked about struggles like hers, promising to fight. He tapped the payment record for Riley Roberts, stating Maria's $50 helped pay your boyfriend $6,000 a month to produce nothing. His voice dropped lower as he said, Maria skipped meals so her kids could eat that week, and her donation subsidized your boyfriend. Ocasio-Cortez blinked rapidly with eyes getting wet, whether from emotion or calculation, as she claimed that was a gross mischaracterization of finance. Is it? Bongino asked, pulling out an email printout saying, let me read you something from your personal account to Saikat Chakrabarti. Dated March 15th of 2019, he read slowly, ensuring every word was captured, saying, make sure the transfers do not look connected. Use different entity names for each step, so the small donors can never find out who is really benefiting from their money. Keep it clean on paper, he read, setting the email down, noting that is not staff making accounting errors or confusion about regulations. That is you personally and directly instructing your chief of staff to hide where the money was going, he said as a Democrat shifted. The ranking member stared at the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, as Bongino said, you told Maria Gonzalez this was a revolution. You told thousands of donors their money was funding a fight for the working class against the corrupt establishment. But his voice hardened. It was funding your inner circle and your boyfriend and your political operatives and your personal lifestyle, he said, pulling out one final document. The total amount of donor money that went directly to entities controlled by you or your boyfriend or associates is $4 million. Based on FEC filings and corporate records, it is $4.2 million from people like Maria Gonzalez, who sacrificed for you. He closed that section, noting that is just the money we can trace to American donors, but not all money came from Americans. He opened the next section, saying that is where this story gets really dark, and turned to a new tab with photographs clipped. June 24, 2018, was a date that transformed your career and made you a national figure, he said, holding up the famous photograph. Every person in America had seen Ocasio-Cortez at the border fence in Texas, with hand pressed over her mouth and tears streaming. It was the image of compassion confronting cruelty, and it went viral within hours, being shared millions of times, launching news segments. It turned you from a long-shot challenger into a national icon, he said, setting it down gently, almost reverently, describing the young Congresswoman. It was powerful and moving, and exactly what the moment needed. But he paused, noting there is just one problem with that narrative. He held up another photograph taken 5 minutes before the famous shot, at the same location on the same day by the same photographer. The photographer kept all his images and shared the complete sequence with federal investigators, showing Ocasio-Cortez in the same white outfit, but laughing. She was checking her makeup in a phone screen and adjusting her hair for the cameras. And then he showed a third image. This one was taken 12 minutes after the crying photo, showing her smiling broadly and posing for selfies with supporters without tears. Your grief lasted exactly as long as it needed to, for the photographers to get the shot, which was approximately 5 minutes. Ocasio-Cortez shook her head vigorously, claiming those photos were taken out of context, and she was genuinely overwhelmed by what she saw. Were you? Bongino asked, pulling out a text message log from her communications director sent 3 hours before she arrived at the facility. Make sure photographers are positioned at the fence before she arrives. We need the emotion shot, he read from the printout. Have tissues ready in case she needs them, and tell her to think about something sad if she needs to get tears going. He set it down, saying, the emotion shot is what your team called it, rather than a genuine moment of human compassion. He pulled out another text exchange sent from her to her campaign manager 2 hours after the photos were taken, reading the quote, "The crying pic is blowing up everywhere, and this is going to be massive for fundraising, so get the donation page ready." We need to capitalize before the news cycle moves on. He read as his voice dropped lower and harder regarding the children there. Their fear was real, and their confusion about being separated from their parents was real, and their suffering was real. He looked at her. "And you use them as props for a fundraising email," he said, as Ocasio-Cortez's voice cracked, claiming she cared deeply about children. "I have fought tirelessly for immigration reform," she said. But Bongino pulled out a calendar document showing her official congressional schedule for 2 years. "Let's count how many times you visited a border facility to actually engage with the issue," he said, flipping through the pages. "The answer is 0, because you never went back once since the photo opportunity was sufficient," he said, pulling out more documents. "But you did find time to do 427 media interviews about the border and found time for magazine photo shoots. You found time to raise $11.3 million off immigration-related appeals," he said, setting the papers down, spreading out social media posts. "You just never found time to go back and do anything substantive about the problem," he said, noting you called those facilities concentration camps. "You compared Border Patrol agents to Nazi guards and said America was operating a system of state-sponsored terror against brown children. Strong words designed to generate maximum outrage and maximum donations," he said, pulling out a different document regarding the targets on agents. He read from an incident report where 3 Border Patrol agents were physically assaulted by protesters who cited her rhetoric as justification. One of them, named Agent Manuel Padilla, was hospitalized for 2 weeks with a severe concussion and 3 broken ribs, he noted. He has a wife and 3 young children who spent those 2 weeks wondering if their father would ever be the same, he said. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, but nothing came out as he noted, "You got your headlines, and Agent Padilla got brain damage. Let's examine what you actually did for immigration policy beyond tweets and cable news appearances," he said, holding up a thin document. "This is every piece of immigration-related legislation you have sponsored in 4 years in Congress," he said, flipping through the pages slowly. "Resolutions and non-binding statements and symbolic gestures and press release material designed to generate social media engagement," he listed, setting it down. "Not a single substantive bill became law, and not one policy change actually helped a single immigrant family, because it was just performance." He pulled out financial records showing while she performed outrage. Something interesting was happening with her fundraising involving open border advocacy groups, organizations pushing for ending all deportations and removing every barrier to entry donated heavily to your PACs after that photo went viral. Some of these organizations have been flagged by law enforcement for concerning connections with money flows tracing back to people who profit. Ocasio-Cortez slammed her hand on the table, shouting, "That is an outrageous and racist insinuation," but Bongino held up a DHS report. "This is from an ongoing investigation into funding networks for organizations that actively work to undermine border security," he said calmly. "Your PACs received donations from 3 groups specifically named in this report," he said, asking if she checked where the money came from. "Did you ask questions about these donors, or do any due diligence at all?" he asked, but was met with silence. "You just cashed the checks and kept performing," he said, leaning forward slightly, noting every year thousands of migrants die crossing the desert. They were told the border was open and America was waiting with welcome arms, so women are assaulted and children are trafficked. Families pay their entire life savings to criminal organizations who leave them to die in the heat, he said with a voice nearing anger. "You profit from the chaos and fundraise off the suffering, building your political brand on the bodies of people you claim to care." He closed that section, stating exploiting immigrants for donations is not even the worst thing she has done, opening the next section. The worst thing is what you really think about the people who actually voted for you and believed you were one of them." Bongino paused, and his voice changed to something quieter and almost sad, saying, "This is the part that is going to hurt most. Not you, Congresswoman, because you already know what is in here. Since you lived it," he said, looking toward the gallery and cameras. "This is going to hurt the people watching at home, who believed in you and saw you as a symbol of hope." He opened the folder, suggesting they start with Amazon, causing Ocasio-Cortez to stiffen visibly as her hands gripped the table edge. Amazon announced plans in 2019 to build a second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, which is your district, he said, extracting projections. 25,000 jobs were promised, and not minimum wage positions, but professional roles with an average salary of $150,000. Direct investment of over $2 billion into your community would have funded schools and infrastructure for decades, he said, spreading news clippings. You led the opposition, calling it corporate welfare and a giveaway to a billionaire who did not need help, he said. Amazon pulled out and took those jobs elsewhere, investing those billions in a different community, he noted, looking at her, saying, "You celebrated. You called it a victory for the people, and your supporters cheered, but he asked a victory for which people exactly? Pulling an email. This is from your personal account sent to a major donor, 1 week after Amazon announced they were withdrawing." He read slowly. "The Amazon thing worked out even better than we expected, because those tech workers would have completely gentrified the district within 5 years. They would have voted for centrist Democrats, or even Republicans, so it is better to keep the current voter base in place. Poor people who depend on government programs are reliable voters for us, and that is our base and our path to power." The hearing room was absolutely silent, and no one moved as Bongino said, "You did not kill those jobs because of principle. You killed them because financially secure and well-educated voters might not need you anymore," he said, setting the email down on the table. 25,000 families lost chances to build wealth and buy homes and send kids to college to achieve the American dream. You killed it deliberately because their success would have threatened your political power, he said, as Ocasio-Cortez shook with a strangled voice. "That email is not what I meant and is being taken completely out of context," she stammered. But he asked what she meant. "Explain to the people in your district what you meant when you said it is better to keep them poor and dependent." She did not answer, so Bongino pulled out phone records, saying Amazon was cold calculation. But this next part is personal. These are text messages from your personal cell phone obtained legally through a warrant issued as part of an ongoing federal investigation. He found a specific page from March 2021 showing a text message to a college friend from her Boston University days. These Bronx people are honestly so easy to manipulate if you just say the word socialism. A few times, he read slowly. Throw in some Spanish phrases and they cheer like trained seals. He read, causing gasps from the gallery as a staffer walked out. Same conversation. 2 minutes later, she wrote, "They will vote for me literally no matter what I do because they are not smart. They are not smart enough to realize when they are being played, so all I have to do is say, I am fighting." Someone in the gallery was crying as he read another text, saying, "The Bronx is basically just my brand at this point. Like a logo I own, and I would never in a million years actually live there again. Can you imagine?" he read. He set the phone records down, saying, "Those are your words and private thoughts. Written when you thought no one would see." Ocasio-Cortez's voice was barely a whisper, saying, "Those texts are taken out of context," and she was venting about the pressures. What context makes it acceptable to call your voters trained seals or to say they are too stupid to know they are played. What context makes calling your district just a brand you own anything other than contempt for the people who elected you? Bongino did not wait for an answer, saying, "There is no context that makes any of that acceptable, just you believing." He pulled out more documents to discuss who she actually employs and who she trusts to serve her constituents, spreading out personnel records. 14 full-time staffers work in your congressional office, and I went through their backgrounds and their resumes and their histories, he said. 12 of them are from out of state, moving to New York to work for you, and 10 have Ivy League degrees. Only 2 actually grew up in your district, and only 2 are actually from the community you claim to represent, he noted. The champion of the working-class Bronx cannot find qualified workers from the Bronx, he said, pulling out another document regarding her Hispanic outreach coordinator. This is the person responsible for connecting you with the Latino community. Yet she was raised in suburban Connecticut and attended Yale. She does not speak fluent Spanish, he said, setting it down, but she had the right family connections and knew the right people. Meanwhile, there are young people in your district who would give anything for a chance to work in Congress, he said, shaking his head. Kids who grew up in the Bronx and went to public schools and actually know the community could actually connect with constituents. You never gave them a chance because they did not have the right credentials or the right pedigrees, Bongino said, pulling evidence. Speaking of your connection to the community, let's talk about your heritage and your identity, he said, causing Ocasio-Cortez to tense visibly. You present yourself as a Latina from the Bronx and a daughter of the working class connected to her Puerto Rican roots. He pulled out a transcript from a Univision interview last year where she attempted to answer several questions in Spanish, reading the analysis. A professional linguist stated, "The subject speaks Spanish at approximately an intermediate tourist level, and her pronunciation is heavily Americanized," he read. Her grammar is consistently incorrect in ways that a native speaker raised in a Spanish-speaking household would never make, the expert noted. The errors suggest someone who learned Spanish as a second language in school, rather than at home, he said, setting it down. You perform being Latina for the cameras and use Spanish phrases as props, but you never really had the actual culture or connection. Ocasio-Cortez was crying now, with tears cutting lines through her makeup, as she insisted her family is Puerto Rican, and this is racist. It is not an attack on Puerto Rican's congresswoman, but an observation about the gap between the identity you perform and who you are. Bongino's voice softened, not with sympathy, but with pity, noting she grew up in Yorktown Heights, where median income is $96,000. One of the wealthier suburbs in New York, with nice houses and good schools, and safe streets and country clubs nearby. He paused. There is nothing wrong with having a comfortable childhood or being fortunate. He looked at her. But that is not the story you tell. You tell people you are from the Bronx and from the struggle, because that story sells better and gets donations and wins elections. He shook his head slowly, saying, You stole the identity of your own community and appropriated their struggle and pain to advance your career. In private, you laugh at them for being stupid enough to believe you, he said, closing the folder, concluding, That is not democratic socialism. That is not fighting for the working class. That is just fraud, plain and simple fraud, he said as the hearing room felt different. The energy had shifted completely, and the confident arena of political theater had become something quieter and sadder as Ocasio-Cortez sat slumped. Her makeup was ruined, and the polished warrior was replaced by something smaller and broken, as she said she wanted to respond. I have the right to respond to these accusations, she said, her voice thick from crying, as Chairman James nodded, allowing her a statement. Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her chair, trying to find the fire that had always come so naturally before, and trying to summon the fighter. "This is a political witch hunt," she began with a cracking voice, pushing through to call it a coordinated attack by right-wing forces. "They are terrified of strong, progressive women," she said, claiming every piece of evidence presented was taken out of context and twisted and manipulated. "People who want to silence the voice of working people in this country are weaponizing this," she said, looking at the cameras for her audience. "They are afraid of us and a movement that threatens their grip on power, so they dig through our emails and private messages. They look for anything they can twist into a scandal," she said, letting her voice gain some strength, declaring she would not be silenced. "I will not be intimidated, and I will not apologize for fighting for the people who need a champion in Washington," she stated. She turned to face Bongino directly, calling him a failed cop who could not cut it in law enforcement and a conspiracy theorist. "You peddle nonsense to angry people for money, and are a puppet for billionaires who want to crush the dreams of ordinary Americans. Nothing you have said here today changes who I am or what I stand for," she said, lifting her chin as the room waited. Bongino slowly reached back into his briefcase, asking if she was done, and pulled out one final document, saying he had something else. He set it on the table, explaining it was a cooperation agreement signed 6 months ago by Saikat Chakrabarti, her former chief of staff. "The man who built your entire political operation from the ground up has been talking to federal investigators for half a year," he said. The color drained completely from Ocasio-Cortez's face as he explained Saikat provided the emails and financial records and text messages presented today. "Everything came from the man who knows exactly how your operation worked, because he helped build it," Bongino said, pulling out another document. "Your boyfriend, Riley Roberts, has been interviewed twice by the FBI and provided detailed records of every payment he received and what he did, which was nothing." He added, withdrawing another document showing 4 former staff members have given sworn statements about the working conditions in her office. They testified about the unpaid overtime and the verbal abuse, and the threats against anyone who complained, he said, spreading them all across the table. "You called this a witch hunt, but witch hunts chase imaginary enemies, while the evidence against you is documented and corroborated and real." Ocasio-Cortez turned desperately to her colleagues, the other members of the squad who had stood beside her through every controversy and defended her. "Ilhan and Rashida and Ayana, you know this is political persecution," she said, asking them to say something and tell them, but silence followed. Representative Omar studied her notes intently, while Representative Clyde was suddenly fascinated by her phone, and Representative Presley looked away toward the gallery. No one spoke, so Bongino said quietly, "They are not coming to rescue you because they have known this was coming for weeks. We made sure they knew, and they have already made their choices," he said, pulling out printed statements, starting with Representative Omar. She stated she has no knowledge of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's financial arrangements and cannot speak to any ongoing investigation, he read from the paper. Representative Tlaib released a statement this morning saying each congressional office is responsible for its own compliance and wishing her colleague well during this. Representative Presley has not released a formal statement, but she unfollowed you on all social media platforms yesterday and deleted every photograph of you. He set the papers down, noting they saw the evidence and calculated the odds and chose to save themselves as Ocasio-Cortez looked around. She looked with growing desperation at her staff, who would not meet her eyes, and at her colleagues, finding reasons to be elsewhere. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of her collapse, as she realized she was utterly alone, and whispered, "This is not fair." The words came out broken like a child's, as she said she was trying to help people and trying to change things. "I was trying to make a difference," she said. But Bongino's voice was not cruel when he responded, only tired and perhaps disappointed. "Maybe you were once at the beginning, and maybe there was a version of you who actually believed the things you said." He closed his briefcase, saying, "Somewhere along the way you started believing you were special and that the rules did not apply. You believed you were too important to be held accountable, and that the people who supported you were tools to be used rather than served. I do not think you are evil, Congresswoman, but I think you are what happens when someone gets famous too fast," he said. "You got too much power too young with no one around willing to tell you no, so you got lost somewhere along the way. You lost yourself between your first viral tweet and your 50th magazine cover," he said, standing up. "But that does not undo the damage. It does not give back the money, or unbreak the trust, or help the people you hurt," he concluded as Chairman James spoke. The chairman cleared his throat, addressing the room formally stating, "The committee has heard extensive testimony and examined substantial evidence regarding potential violations." He mentioned federal campaign finance law and wire fraud statutes and congressional ethics standards, pausing to let the weight of his words settle. "Based on the proceedings today, I am directing committee staff to prepare a formal referral to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. Additionally, I am recommending that the House Ethics Committee open its own investigation immediately," he said, looking at Ocasio-Cortez, advising her to retain counsel. "This hearing is adjourned," he said, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack as Ocasio-Cortez tried to stand, but her legs failed. She grabbed the table for support with knuckles white against the wood and pushed away her staff with trembling hands, saying she could walk. She made it 3 steps toward the door, before the wall of camera flashes started like a blinding storm of light and noise. Reporters shouted questions from every direction, asking if she would resign and if she had a response to the text messages displayed. "What do you say to the donors who trusted you? And will you cooperate with the federal investigation?" they asked. But she did not answer. She could not answer because words had always been her weapon, but now they had abandoned her completely as the door closed behind her. The cameras kept flashing, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already gone, and her career did not end with handcuffs or a dramatic confrontation. It ended with silence and closed doors, and somehow that was worse as the news spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 1 hour, the video clips were everywhere, and social media exploded with reaction, while every cable network cleared their regular programming for coverage. Within 3 hours, the first calls for resignation came from members of her own party, which were quiet and careful calls, but calls nonetheless. In the Bronx, the reaction was different from the political chatter in Washington, as Maria Gonzalez sat in her small apartment watching the news. She watched on a television she could not afford to replace, where the screen was old and fuzzy, but the images were clear enough. In her weathered hands, she held a donation receipt from 2018 for $50, which was a full day's wages from years ago. She had believed when a local reporter found her and knocked on her door with a camera crew looking for the human story. "I believed in her," Maria said quietly in English, that was accented but clear because she had practiced these words in her head. "I told my daughters to look at this woman because she looks like us and talks about our struggles and came from nothing. Now she is in Congress fighting for people like us," she had said, looking down at the faded receipt, tears coming slowly. "I skipped buying groceries that week to send her that money, telling myself it was an investment in our future and our community. I thought it was an investment in someone who understood," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "but she called us stupid. She said we were easy to manipulate, And she laughed at us with her rich friends, she added when the reporter asked for comment. Maria thought for a long moment before answering that she wanted to say Ocasio-Cortez broke something important, and not just her trust. She broke something bigger and made people like me afraid to believe in anyone ever again, she said, looking at the donation receipt. That is the worst part, not the $50 which I can earn back, but the hope she stole I cannot recover. Across the district, similar scenes played out through the evening and into the night, in bodegas and laundromats and crowded apartments. People who had believed watched their faith collapse in real time, realizing they had given her their votes and dreams for something better. She had given them a performance, while Dan Bongino did one interview that evening, turning down the others when asked if he was proud. Proud is not the right word for any of this, because there is nothing here to be proud of, he said, shaking his head. A young woman destroyed her own career through arrogance and greed, and thousands of people who believed in her feel betrayed tonight. Her district still lacks the jobs she killed, and the immigrant families she used as props are still suffering at the border. I did not create this situation, I just exposed it and presented evidence, letting people draw their own conclusions, he told the camera. When asked if he felt sympathy, he said he felt sympathy for who she could have been, because she had real gifts and intelligence. She had charisma and the ability to connect with people and inspire them. So if she had used those gifts honestly, she could have succeeded. She might have accomplished something meaningful, but she made different choices, and those choices led. Here, he said, shaking his head one last time. Later that night, Dan Bongino sat alone in his home office with the television off and his phone silenced and the folder filed. He thought about the young woman who walked into Congress 4 years ago and how he had watched her rise like everyone else. She was 29 years old and absolutely sure she was going to change the world. But somewhere along the way, she started compromising. Small choices became big ones until the lies grew too heavy, and the person she performed had nothing in common with who she was. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at the bureau saying a new file would be on his desk tomorrow with a different name. It was the same pattern, so Bongino read the message twice, then set his phone down, realizing there was always another politician who believed. There was always another true believer who traded principles for power and broke promises to the people who could least afford broken promises. He turned off the light and headed home to his family, knowing the work would continue as it always did, while Ocasio-Cortez resigned 3 days later. Her letter cited personal matters without admitting wrongdoing or apologizing, but in the Bronx, Maria Gonzalez went back to work at the laundromat. She had bills to pay and children to feed, so she took down the poster she had kept on her wall with the slogan. She folded it carefully and put it in the trash, because some things once broken cannot be repaired.